Every year, tens of thousands of people drive past the iconic Jones Beach water tower. But few know about the man whose name and legacy has left an indelible mark on the Long Island landscape. So let's discover the story of Major Thomas Jones. A soldier, a sailor, a whaler, a sheriff, and perhaps even a pirate, Thomas Jones was a complex man of many talents, whose story begins a long way from the shores of Long Island, across the Atlantic, and all the way back to 17th century Ireland. Serving on the losing side of a war in Ireland, Thomas Jones, forced to flee his homeland, turned to a life of high seas adventure. Sailing to the Americas, Jones received a commission to attack Spanish ships and bring their wealth back to the colony of New York. Legally, he was a privateer, but some believe that he was in reality acting as a pirate. It was also during this time that Jones became friends with Captain Thomas Townsend, a friendship that would eventually see Jones marrying Townsend's young daughter, Freelove. Although now a married man, Thomas Jones continued living a life at sea that would continue to keep him away from his wife for the next 3 years. While Jones was away at sea, his wife and father-in-law moved to Long Island, where Captain Townsend had been making large purchases of land from the local native tribes. When Thomas Jones finally returned home to settle down with his wife, they moved into a house that his father-in-law, Captain Townsend, gave them as a gift. It wasn't long before Jones was using the wealth he had amassed as a privateer to make his own land purchases from the natives, and by the time of his death, he would possess several thousand acres of land. Around 1696, he moved to Fort Neck, where he built his own house. This would become the first brick structure out on the eastern end of Long Island, and would become known as the Old Brick House. At the time, the western part of Long Island was inhabited mostly by the local natives, and with few roads, the European colonists saw this region as an untamed wilderness. So Jones built a house he could easily defend if needed. It was a house with walls 7 inches thick, said to be bulletproof, and a structure that would stand for almost 200 years and become known as one of the island's most haunted houses. In the late 17th century, the town of Oyster Bay, with its abundance of channels and inlets, had a reputation for being a safe harbor for pirates. So it was no wonder that accusations of piracy continued to follow Thomas Jones as he settled down and became a prominent and respected landowner. In 1698, the colonial governor of New York, at that time Richard Coate, 1st Earl of Bellamont, seemed to especially have it in for Jones. Not surprising, since Bellamont was a fellow Irishman who was a strong supporter of King William III. Earl Bellamont, who was now actively rooting out piracy in the colonies, wrote several letters in which he specifically accuses Thomas Jones of piracy. However, none of the accusations or connections with piracy seemed to put a halt to Thomas Jones's advancement and reputation in Long Island society. In 1699, Thomas Jones had the position of a freeholder. This position gave him certain rights, one of which was that he was allowed to herd cattle. In October of 1702, the colonial governor of New York, now Edward Hyde, 3rd Earl of Clarendon, commissioned Jones to be captain of the Queens County Militia. 2 years later, in October of 1704, he was appointed High Sheriff of Queens. And 2 years after that, on April 3rd, 1706, was made Major of the Queens County Regiment. Hereafter, all references to Thomas Jones call him Major Thomas Jones. Some of the resources state that he received this title during his military service in Ireland, but I couldn't find any primary sources to support this. So I believe that the first time he received the title of Major was when he was given this rank in the Queen's Regiment. Although he had finally given up the life of a privateer and entered the colonial military service, it seems Thomas Jones, now officially Major Thomas Jones, could not completely walk away from a life at sea. Because even though he had amassed a vast holding of land, with all the titles and industry that came with it, he decided to take part in Long Island's lucrative whaling industry. This whale fishery was granted to Major Jones by Governor Clarendon, who granted a license to take drift whales and ye-gut adjoining Mr. Nichols' land and the west end of Gravesend Beach. This included a station on what today is known as Jones Beach. Major Jones was engaged in this business until as late as September of 1710. Major Jones seemed to have had a really close friendship with Governor Clarendon, and there's an interesting anecdote that shows just how close. A sheriff issued an arrest warrant for Major Thomas Jones, But Jones, being forewarned of the approach of the sheriff's posse, placed a table across the entrance of his house, completely blocking up the doorway, and loaded his pistols. And when the posse arrived, they found Major Jones waiting for them. After reading the arrest papers, Jones sat down and wrote a note to Governor Clarendon. This he handed to the posse, remarking that he would not subject himself to arrest, and pointing to his pistols, he added that if they insisted upon arresting him, he would then and there fight. The posse, well, they quickly retreated. Governor Clarendon, after reading the note, personally journeyed out to visit Major Jones, where he was greeted warmly and royally entertained in the old brick house. Needless to say, Governor Clarendon enjoyed a nice meal, and Major Jones was not arrested. Major Jones enjoyed a privileged lifestyle in his later years, using the money from the fishery to further extend his land holdings. As early as 1710, he held the office of supervisor of the town of Oyster Bay, an office he was annually re-elected to and would hold until his death. In September of 1710, the colonial governor of New York, now being Robert Hunter, appointed Jones the Ranger General of the island of Nassau, Nassau being the British name of Long Island at the time. This made him an officer of the crown, with royal rights or franchises of waifs, estrays, hunting, royal fish, forfeitures, and the like. In a way, Thomas Jones had now come full circle, from fighting on an island for the throne of King James II, to now serving his daughter, Queen Anne of England, on an island in a far-off new world. On December 13th, 1713, Major Thomas Jones died. It was said that he was buried on a slight elevation on the left bank of the Massapequa River, beside a small Native American fortification. His tombstone was made of hard Rhode Island redstone, and it bore an inscription that he himself had written. Here lies interred the body of Major Thomas Jones, who came from Strabane in the Kingdom of Ireland, settled here and died, December 13th, 1713. From distant lands to this wild waste, he came to the seat he chose, and here he fixed his name. Long may his sons this peaceful spot enjoy, and no ill fate his offspring here annoy. For many years after his death, it was the common belief that some of Major Jones's wealth was buried with him. So it wasn't long before vandals came to open the grave in a quest for relics, leaving Jones's bones strewn out upon the ground. After the reinterment, it was discovered that one of the bones was stolen in the hopes of gaining a reward. This last bone was eventually recovered, and in 1893, all the remains were moved and placed in the graveyard adjoining the Old Grace Church, where they remain undisturbed to this day. Major Thomas Jones left behind a civic legacy that would be carried on by his children and grandchildren who would find themselves on opposite sides of the Revolutionary War as it swept through Long Island. As a soldier fighting for a lost cause, to a notorious ship's captain roving the seas for wealth and adventure, to a prosperous and influential landowner during the expansion and settlement of Long Island, Major Thomas Jones lived a life of extremes and took full advantage of every opportunity that came his way. Yet today, few may remember the legacy of Major Thomas Jones, but his is a name that will forever be ingrained in the Long Island landscape.